We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph and Mesechet Sukkah. This is Sukkah Daf 13a. On the previous Amud, Abaye makes a distinction between shushay and shvutzrei. These are both different kinds of vegetation that are not edible for human consumption. And Abaye says shushay can be used as schach and shvutzrei cannot be used as schach. And the Gemara wants to understand the difference. And the Gemara says, "Tesari rechayu shavik lu v'nafik." When it comes to shvutzrei, it smells bad, and therefore the person is going to leave the sukkah. That's why you're not supposed to use that for schach. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chanan Bar Rava says, Hani hizmi vihigi, if you have these thorns or you have these shrubs, misachin behu, you're allowed to use them for schach. Abaye says, Behizmi misachachinan. When it comes to the thorns, that's okay. Behigi lo misachin. When it comes to the shrubs, you can't use those. My time, and what's the reason? Kevin de nasri tarfayu shavik lavinafik. Since the leaves fall off and it's going to again ruin your time in the sukkah, you're going to end up leaving the sukkah. Therefore, you cannot use it. And the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Gidel Amar Rav. Rav Gidel says in the name of Rav, Hayafkusa de dikla, the offshoots of the palm tree misachin behu. You're allowed to use that for schach. Rashi over here says Afkusa de dikla motze hadekel kashu samach lekarka. It's the offshoots of the palm tree near the ground. Yotzim bo dukran harbe saviv saviv. There's a lot of offshoots that come out surrounding it. So again, you're allowed to use that as schach. And the Gemara continues, Afagav da'agidi eged bidei shamayim lo shmei eged. Now, even though these are bound together, that's bidei shamayim. That's bound together by heaven, so to speak. In other words, it's not a human that bound it together. That's not called an eged, so it's not a problem. Rashi over here says, V'afagav da'agidi shemechubar and anfeo ilan yachad. The various branches of the tree are actually attached to each other. V'dami lechavilan. It's kind of similar to bundles that we said in the Mishnah. The Amron that we said, Ein mesachim ben, you're not allowed to use bundles. So maybe you would think it's a problem. So again, he says, eged bidei shamayim is lo shmei eged, and the Gemara continues, Afagav the hadar agid lahu igud bechad lo shmei eged. And even if the person himself goes and binds it now, that's also not a problem of eged, as Rashi here will explain. The Afagav the hadar agid lahu iu hanofim shel mala. So we're talking about the top part of the branches that you're trying to bind them together. Kedei lahashkiv, and that allows it to rest properly on the top of the sukkah. Mimnesha misfatzlan lakan lakan v'nokfin lamala vein sosman hanekiv. Because if you don't bind it together, it's going to shoot all over the place. It's not going to be a good way of closing up the top of the sukkah, but that's okay if you bind that area. Eged bechad lo shmei eged, meaning kol davar yechidi hamechuber yachad, something that's already bound as one. That's what it means. Eged bechad, something that's already one unit. V'yogdo b'fnei atzmo ein agud. If you go bind that thing which is already one unit, that's not called an aguda. Achitein davar acher imo v'yegdem yachad. It's only called an aguda if you take things that are actually separate and you bind them together. That's why in this case it's not a problem. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. Amar Rav Chisda Amar Ravina Bar Shila. Rav Chisda says in the name of Ravina Bar Shila, Hani Dukre Dekani, if you have the offshoots of the reeds, very similar to the offshoots of the palm trees, Mesachin Buhu, you're allowed to use that. Schach Afagav Da'agidin, even though they're bound together as well. Eged Bidei Shamayim Lo Shmei Eged, if it's bound together by heaven, that's not called bound together. And Afagav Dahadar Agid Lahu Igud Bechad Lo Shmei Eged. And even though the person himself goes and binds part of it together, when it's one unit and you bind together something that's already one unit, that's not called an Eged. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Nami Hach, we learned in a brisa like this as well. Konim v'dukranin misachin bohen. Konim and dukranin. Right now the Gemara thinks these are two separate things. Reeds and spades, you're allowed to use them for schach. Gemara says konim shita. Obviously you can use reeds for schach. So emo konim shel dukranin. What we mean to say over here in this brisa is exactly what we said before. We're saying the offshoots of the reeds, it's all one thing. Misachin bohen, you're allowed to use that as schach. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Chisda Amar Ravina Bar Shila, and Rav Chisda says, in the name of Ravina Bar Shila, Hani mirarisa de agma, if you have the maror, the bitter herbs that grow in the swamp, Adam yotze b'hen yedei chovasu b'Pesach, a person can fulfill his obligation to eat maror with that item on Pesach. And so the Gemara asks, Mesa, we have a question from the following, Azov, anytime we have a halacha that refers to using an Azov, a hyssop, v'lo Azov yavan, so you can't use a Greek hyssop, v'lo Azov kochali, you can't use a hyssop that's blue, that's a blue color, v'lo Azov midbari, you can't use one from the wilderness. V'lo Azov Romi, you can't use a Roman hyssop. V'lo Azov sheyesh lo shem lavoy. The point is you can't use any hyssop that has another name added to it. If it has a qualifier on it, like these cases, Azov Yavan, Azov Romi, etc., that's going to be a problem. It just has to be the standard Azov. So the question is, the same thing should be true over here. The Marisa de Agama, it's not Morer, it's Morer of the Agam. Therefore, it should not be good for the mitzvah, for the fulfillment of the obligation of Morer. So the Gemara answers, Amar Abaya says, Kol shenishtana shemo kodem matan Torah, anything that had different names before matan Torah. Ubaza Torah v'hikbid olen, the Torah came along and was makbid and said it has to be this name and not that name. B'yadua sheyesh lo shem lavoy. So in that situation, you have a situation where there is a shem lavoy that can make it problematic. So that's why by the case of Azov, these other kinds of Azovs existed before matan Torah. So if the Torah says Azov, it means an Azov and not an Azov Yavan, an Azov and not an Azov Romi, etc. However, Vahani, but over here when we're talking about the Morer, Lo Nishtana Shemayu Kodem Matan Torah Klal, there was no different name before Matan Torah. It was all Morer. After Matan Torah developed a different name, that's not going to affect the halach in this case. Rava says a different answer. Hani mirarisa stama shemayu. Even this Morer of the Agam is really called Morer. It's not called Morer of the Agam. V'hai dekarilu mirarisa de Agma. The only reason people call it Marisa de Agma, mishum de mishtakach bi Agma, because it happens to be found in the swamp, but that's not really its name. That's why it's okay to use for the mitzvah of Morer. And the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Chisda says, Iged bechad lo shmei eged. Again, if you bind something that's already one unit, that's not called bound. Shalosh shmei eged. 3 is considered bound. Shnayim, if you have 2 items, machlokas Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan. That's going to be a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan, as the Gemara will explain. Rashi over here says, Lo shmei eged lo le'inyan chavila l'schach. First of all, it's not called an eged in terms of bundles for schach. As we said, bundles for schach are problematic. V'lo le'inyan agudas ezov. Also, there's halachas where you have to have a hyssop that's bound. For example, by para aduma, and part of the process involves taking a hyssop branch, which is part of a binding. You're binding things together. So that also as well, that's not considered to be an eged if it's already 1 unit. 3 again is considered to be bound together. 2 items, that's already a machlokas Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan. The Gemara explains. Tetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, this is by Para Aduma, mitzvahs Azov, the mitzvah of taking this Azov that's bound together, shalosha klochim, so you have to have 3 stalks, uvahen shalosha givolin, and within those 3 stalks, they have to have 3 stems. And Rabbi Yossi says, mitzvahs Azov shalosha givolin. When it comes to the mitzvahs Azov, it's 3 stems. V'shirav shnayim, and the remnant is 2. V'gardumav kolshu, and if you, as Rashi will explain over here, if you have that middle part, even if a small amount is remaining, that's going to be good enough. Rashi over here explains. Shalosha klochen, translated as 3 stalks, sharashin, the stalks are like the roots. Uvahen shalosha givolin, and on those you have 3 stems. Givol l'chol klach means to say each shoresh, each klach has a stem. Givol hu kono ha'emtsai. The givol is the kono ha'emtsai. It's that middle branch. Shazera barosho kakanvas bepishtin. And you have the seed at the top of it. Rabbi Yossi Omer lakaman mefarish pluksai. Rabbi Yossi says this idea of having the remnant, that will be explained later on. Shirav. What does Rabbi Yossi mean when he says Shirav? Meaning, im nafal ha'echad lachar zman. Let's say you were originally bound together, there were 3, but then one of them falls off. Shirav kisherim b'shnayim. As long as you have 2 left, that's going to be good enough. And gardumov, what does that mean? Kishemazin bo, when you would sprinkle with this thing, pa'amim harbe, many times, mitoch shegivolav rachim, because of the fact that these stems are soft, so mishtabrim, so they break. V'chol shehu ha'mishtayir ba'aguda kosher. He says, as long as there's a tiny amount remaining that's going to be kosher, but each one has to be there. There just has to be the smallest amount left from each one that's bound together. That's called agudaso kayemes. That's called the bundle is kayem, and that's going to be okay. In other words, Rabbi Yossi says, the mitzvah is with 3. If you have left over, one of them falls off, you have 2 stems, that's also okay. And if you beat it and those stems get whittled down, as long as there's a kol shu left, that's going to be fine. So now the Gemara explains what Rav Chisda was saying. Where does Rav Chisda see a machlokas, Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi, about what's considered a bound item? So Kasalka diet, and right now we think as follows. Midashirav shnayim, from the fact that Rabbi Yossi says if you have leftover, you have to have 2, so tchilaso nami shnayim. What we think Rabbi Yossi means is even from the beginning, if you just bind together 2 stems, that's going to be considered bound. When Rabbi Yossi says mitzvahs ezov shlosha, that's just a mitzvah lechatchila. But really, you only need 2. So 2 is considered to be an eged. Umid Rabbi Yossi shlosha lemitzvah, and from the fact that Rabbi Yossi holds 3 is just a mitzvah lechatchila, the Rabbanan shlosha la'akev. According to the Rabbanan, 3 is something that's required. In other words, that's exactly the machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbanan say in order for something to be considered an eged, you need to have 3, and Rabbi Yossi says you really only need to have 2. The din of 3 is just lemitzvah lechatchila, but really you only need 2, and that's how Rav Chisda understands this machlokas Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan, as Rashi over here explains. Kasalka daite the hadam Rav Chisda shnayim machlokas Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan. Right now we think that what Rav Chisda means is What does it mean that by 2 there's a machlokas Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan? Hachi mefarish pluk sayu. Here's what he's saying. V'achi shaminala demi the shir of shnayim Rabbi Yossi tchilaso nami shnayim di'evid. According to Rabbi Yossi, even from the outset, 2 is considered a bundle b'di'evid. L'chatchila you should have 3. L'mitzvah l'chatchila. Umid Rabbi Yossi boy shalosh miya l'mitzvah. And from the fact that Rabbi Yossi says you need 3 l'chatchila, mechlal Rabbanan dami shlosh l'akev. The Rabbanan are being even more strict. They say you need to have 3. That's a requirement. Di'inu nami l'mitzvah v'lo l'akev. Because if they're just saying l'chatchila also, mayos Rabbi Yossi lefluge, then there's no machlokas here. Umay machlokas to come Rav Chisda to Rabbi Yossi shme'eged Rabbanan lo shme'eged. That wouldn't make sense in terms of Rav Chisda saying the whole machlokas Rabbanan Rabbi Yossi is whether 2 is shmei eged or not. So that's what the Gemara initially thinks. The Gemara initially thinks that Rav Chisda meant that according to Rabbi Yossi, 2 is considered neged. According to the Rabbanan, you need 3 for a neged. But the Gemara says that doesn't fit with another Rabbi Yossi. Vatanya, we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Yossi Omer Ezov Techilaso Shnayim. Here, Rabbi Yossi says by the Ezov, the Techilaso is Shnayim. V'shir of Echad, and the remnant is 1. Pasul, if you have a situation where you start off with 2 and you end up with 1 that's pasul, ve'eno kosher, and it's only kosher ad sheyeh Techilaso Shlosha v'shir of Shnayim. Seems to be over here you have to have Techilaso Shlosha v'shir of Shnayim. Rashi over here says Ezov shetchilaso shnayim pasul, meaning the brayso over here is saying if it starts off with just 2 bound together, it's pasul. V'chein ezov shlosha v'naflu shnayim in hagud, and the same is true if it starts off with 3 and 2 fall off. V'nishtayir echad, you only have 1 remaining pasul, that's also pasul. V'eino kosher, Rabbi Yossi says the only time it's kosher is kolomar ein tchilaso kosher ela b'shlosha. It's got to start off with 3. The botzer mehachi lava aguda, he less than is not an aguda. V'ein shirayim k'sheirim ela b'shnayim, and if something falls off, you have to have at least 2 remaining. In other words, according to this brisa, lichatchila, it has to start off, and I don't mean lichatchila that it's just a mitzvah, but I mean to say it has to start off bound together as 3. That's a requirement. And if something falls off, as long as 2 are remaining, that's still okay. You can still use that agudas ezov. So here it seems to be that there's really a requirement of 3 to be considered a bound and eged according to Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says, Epoch, you're right, we have to reverse what we understood in Rav Chisda. Rabbi Yossi shlosh al-akev. It's actually Rabbi Yossi who's stricter. Rabbi Yossi is the one that says that 3 is something that's ma'akev. It has to at least start off with 3, that's called an eged. L'Rabbanan shlosh al-mitzvah. And when the Rabbanan in this Mishnah said mitzvahs ezov shlosha, they were actually only talking lechatchila. It was Rabbi Yossi that's actually stricter and says it's ma'akev, and that still could explain Rav Chisda, because it's a machlokas, Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi, whether shlosha is la'akev or not, whether you need 3 for this to be considered to be an eged. Rashi over here says, we originally thought that Rav Chisda meant that Rabbi Yossi was the lenient one. Rabbi Yossi shlosh la'akev, but really no, Rabbi Yossi is the one that says shlosh la'akev. And the Rabbanan are the ones that are more lenient. The Rabbanan are the ones that say that the shlosh is just lamitzvah and not la'akev. And the Gemara proves this from another brisa, Vatanya. We learned a brisa that supports this explanation. Ezov tchilaso shnayim v'shirav echad kosher. It says if you have an ezov that starts off bound with 2 and then something falls off and it's remaining 1, it's kosher. V'yeino pasul, it's only pasul at sheyeh tchilaso v'shirav echad. If it starts off and it ends off with 1, Rashi over here says v'atanya b'nichusa. This is a proof. L'Rabbanan lo garsin. And don't have the word l'Rabbanan here. She'ein zu lashon Gemara. That's not how the Gemara would talk. Umiu al karchach Rabbanan kamrila. But nevertheless, this is the Rabbanan. In other words, this brisa is going to be the Rabbanan's position that it's not required to have 3 at the beginning. Rabbi Yossi shlosh al-akev shaminala. We just said that according to Rabbi Yossi, 3 is a requirement. That's what this brisa means. It means to say you have to have tchilaso shnayim. You don't have to have tchilaso shalosh. Ezov shetchilaso shnayim kosher. V'shirav echad nami kosher. The idea is if it starts with 2, it's kosher. If it ends, something falls off, you have 1 remaining, that's kosher. V'lo pasul b'tchilaso ad sheyeh echad. It's only a problem if it starts off with 1. That's a problem. But if it starts off with 2, that's good enough. The kasalka daitach. Now originally the Gemara thinks the seifa nami hachim efarsha ve'in shirav psulam ad sheyeh echad. We think that the seifa means that if it's pasul if the shirav is echad. Ulahachi parach shirav echad salka daitach lifsal v'katani kosher. The Gemara is about to ask. Shirav echad is fine. It's got to be tchilaso shnayim shirav echad. So the Gemara originally thinks that when it says over here ve'eno pasul ad sheyeh tchilaso v'shirav echad, that it means to say if it's shirav echad it's pasul. So that's why the Gemara asks shirav echad pasul. Now you're saying shirav echad is pasul. Ha'amrit shirav echad kosher. But didn't you just say before that shirav echad is kosher? You just said tchilaso shnayim v'shirav echad kosher. The Gemara will go on to say no. What it means in the seifa is if the tchilaso is like the shirav and it's echad, then it's problematic. problematic. The point over here, though, is that according to the Rabbanan, you have to have tchilas of shnayim and shira of echad, and that's going to be kosher. Starts off, you're binding 2, something falls off. As long as you have 1 left, that is kosher. There's no requirement to have 3 to be considered neged, and that supports what we just said. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis.